Now, first, I'm not a professional car repair person. I'm just a hobbyist. I have been working on cars, pretty much all German cars since I was about 15, and I currently own 6 Porsches and 11 Mercedes, and that's kind of what I focus on. And I realize I can't afford the cars that I love without working on them myself, and so that's why I kind of make myself do this. And I also try to apply my experience with the moniker I had when I was working was qualified for the supervision, operation, and maintenance of Navy nuclear propulsion plants. So I try to apply that discipline to the car maintenance I do, and which makes me kind of slow, but it also gives me pretty thorough and usually pretty good results. Now, the topic we're talking about today, the M104 head gasket replacement, I tell you, there's more information online on this than anything I've ever seen or tried to do or look up. And so I'm not going to cover this in step-by-step detail. There's plenty of information out there. What I'm going to tell you, though, is the kind of general overview, but kind of what I learned and what I wasn't really prepared for. So, one comment I'll make is that basically every M104 engine is going to need a head gasket replacement between 100,000 and 200,000 miles. I have 3 of these cars. One of them has 89,000 miles on it yet and hadn't had this done yet. One has 206,000 miles on it, and the service records indicate it was done at about 145,000 miles. And the one I'm talking about today, the SL320, I needed to do this at 129,000 miles, which seemed to me to be kind of early. So then the question is, well, why does this happen? And let me go over to screen share and show you a little bit here. And can you see that picture? You should see a picture. It looks like an oil diagram.
Yes.
And because it is an oil diagram, this is what the M104 oiling system looks like. And the cars tend to have a head gasket external oil leak back on the right rear, and they tend to have a oil leak on the right front up here. If you look at the oiling system, there is a pressurized oil passage that goes up in the back of the right rear of the engine. And if I go forward a little bit here, this is a picture of the head gasket I removed from the car. This, if you can see my pointer here, this is the head bolt hole, but this is also used as an oil passage to get the pressurized oil up to the head. This is a drain, oil drain here, and over here is a coolant passage. And what you see here is a crack between the coolant passage right through the head gasket. And what usually happens on these engines is you start seeing an oil leak back in the right rear of the engine. And when that started happening on this car, you kind of started smelling it and then seeing a little bit of oil smoke. And I wasn't particularly concerned because there wasn't very much usage. And then I started losing coolant. And I wasn't sure at first where it was coming from. And I did a coolant pressure test and I could hear it coming out. It was really a pretty significant coolant leak, and I could very easily locate where it was, which then drove me to need to replace the head gasket. Now for another view, this is the head before I cleaned it. And look at the imprint of the head gasket on this head. This is the pressurized oil passage here. And look how little head gasket was actually sealing in here. And this is the drain line, the drain tube essentially. And look how little head gasket there is in here. And the head gasket, as it ages, kind of shrinks away and exposes one of these, and you end up with oil coming out. Of course, here's the coolant passage, and the crack was right in here. And so that was kind of an eye-opener to me, and the reason why you have to do this on basically all these engines. Now, this is a doable thing by a do-it-yourselfer. It's moderate difficulty, maybe moderate plus, but you really need an engine lift because it's a big head, and you also take the head off with the intake and hopefully the exhaust, and so it's a little heavy and a little unwieldy. And to do that, you also kind of need a load leveler. And I had already had an engine lift, you see here. This is the load leveler that I purchased to do this job. And it's just kind of handy to have, and you especially need it when you're refitting the head. That allows you to get it aligned properly, since the engine itself is inclined and slanted over in the car. So the other thing you'll want is a precision straight edge so you can check for warpage of the head and the block. And the other thing I got on this is a long table. and that's an 8-foot table I just ordered from Walmart. And the reason I got this is because when I do work on the car, what I really like to do is not have this cat back here playing with this toy. Let me throw that over there. But sorry about that. But what I like to do is lay out my all the parts in an order so that when I go back, I know what order I took them off in. And I also bag and tag all of the bolts I remove in a usually Ziploc bag and lay them in order, so then I can tell how the sequence I use for reassembly. And I needed a lot of space to lay this out. So when I was in the middle of this job, I had parts laid out in order on a cardboard piece in a horse stall, and then I had this entire table filled up. The cat didn't have any room to sleep then. And I'll mention a few other little tools. But my approach to doing car work, because of essentially my nuclear background, is FME covers, that is foreign material exclusion covers. When you open up something that something could fall in, you cover it so that nothing can fall in it, and you maintain cleanliness on everything. I mentioned bagging and tagging. And the other thing that's kind of handy is if you have bolts that are different lengths and you need to know where they go, make a pattern, stick them in them, and that way you can always retain where the right bolts go. And this is the cam cover bolts. The middle ones are shorter than the side ones. And of course, always have the procedures that you need and take your time. I mentioned references and procedures, and there's an awful lot of material out. And Kent Bergsma of Mercedes Source did a great video series. Let me come out of screen share for a second here. Did a great video series on this. He was planning to do a 5-part video series. He did 3, and he realized he wasn't making enough money of sales of the video, so he just stopped at 3. But I recommend that you watch that series because it's very good. The thing to realize, though, is it's a 300 SL. So it is not the system I was working on. Mine was a 94th SL320, which is the HFM injection version of the engine, and he was doing it with a KE Jetronic engine, and it's a little different. And since most of the cars with this engine are 124s and I think 211s, they're just all a little different. And you don't really find a good description to an SL320 as you look through these. And I must admit, since they almost seem like an infinite amount of material, I didn't read through everything on the internet. And of course, you have to realize that not everything on the internet's correct either. So I went through a lot of the forum posts. I went through his video series. I got the pieces of the factory workshop manual that I thought I needed. More on that later. And of course, the thing formerly known as EPC, I used that a lot to order parts as I got to places where I realized I needed more parts than I had available. So the strategy on this is to remove the head with the intake and the exhaust manifolds attached, which is the reason for an engine lift and a load leveler. So what did I find challenging? What did I learn? Well, it wasn't really clear to me which part of the intake manifold came off with the head and which part was left on the engine. The HFM system, like on my car, has upper and lower intake manifolds, which are split at large rubber tube connectors. I'm going to go back to screen sharing and show you some pictures. Okay, there. And you look here, this is the picture I showed you a minute ago. This is the upper portion of the manifold, and you split it at these tubes here. In the lower part that stays in the car, if you look down here, you see where those 2 large rubber tubes mate, and the electronic throttle assembly and in the lower portion of the manifold. And since I didn't exactly know, where I was splitting this, I actually ended up removing some pieces down in here that I didn't need to remove, and I ended up having to rework and put them back on. And the other thing that I kind of screwed up is I didn't print out all the relevant parts of the workshop manual as I did this. And I had the head gasket removal procedure and many of the others, but if you've worked out of the Mercedes workshop manual, you realize that it refers you to a lot of other places. And I made some assumptions that I shouldn't have made. And so I didn't have the fan removal procedure. And it turns out, I'll come out of screen share for a second, for the fan removal on this engine, you actually need a special tool. And I had not looked in advance to find this special tool. And this thing is available on, Amazon for like $25. It's not even an expensive tool. So what I did, and I immediately ordered one, and then I went to my local auto parts store, bought the largest channel lock I could, and then ground it down to about that thin and used it to remove the fan while I was waiting for that part to come in. Okay, so I also didn't print out the belt tensioner part. And on 129s, there's at least 3 different belt tensioners, and I was thinking SL 500 with the 3rd tensioner, which is really easy. Instead of printing it out and doing it the right way. And so when I finally got to the belt tensioner and realized I was a little confused, I went upstairs, printed it out, brought it down, and did it the right way. Now, these tensioners require you to loosen what's essentially a clamping bolt and then do an adjustment on a rod that's off behind the tensioner. And the challenge on this engine is that you really can't see the bolt that you have to loosen because it's down below the idler pulley that tensions. You can feel it, but you can't see it. But once I got the factory workshop manual thing printed out, I was able to finally do that. And the other error I made is not printing out the exhaust cam sprocket removal piece. I removed the timing chain by pulling off the exhaust sprocket. When I went back to look for the torque spec, I realized, oh, those are supposed to be one-time bolts, and I didn't buy any new ones. So I've got some new ones sitting downstairs waiting to go on when I get back into that part of the engine. So the basic sequence on this is to, you remove the air filter and MAF sensor, you drain the coolant, you unbolt the exhaust downpipes and pull the cam cover off, and then pull the upper timing cover off. Now, let's see, am I screen sharing right now or not, Diana? I can't remember.
No, you are not.
You are not. Okay, well, let me do a screen share. Okay, there we go. Okay, this is the upper timing cover. You see the picture now?
Yes.
Okay, so when you take that plastic cover off front of the engine, this is what you see. Hopefully not with as much dirt as this one has on it. But there's this vacuum switching mechanism up in here, and you have to be very careful that you know where all these go. But also in an older engine, this stuff's going to be brittle. My car, this hard plastic vacuum line here broke, so I had to go order some more of that. And you have to keep track of all those places. The other thing you have to pay attention to is that you have to pull a timing chain guide, which is down in this area. And if y'all participated in my last year's teleconference about the M117 engine, you basically use the same tool. It's an internally threaded pin that you screw, I think it's an M8 bolt into, and then use this as a puller to get it out. There is a Mercedes specific tool for this. It's a slide hammer. I have it. It doesn't work, but you can put together this very inexpensive pulling tool, which is also shown in this, by just buying a M8. It has to be a 10.9 hardness nut and bolt because you end up with a lot of torque on this little bolt, and then you just space it out and use it as a puller. And this is what the pin looks like. Now these pictures are from an M117 engine, but it's basically the same concept on this. Okay, back to, all right, so once you got the front cover off, you can see the bottom seal of the front cover, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. You got to make sure that you do this marking to ensure that you put the timing chain back on in the same place. The factory workshop manual tells you to remove the intake cam. Now, I really don't like screwing with variable valve actuators, and so what I did is remove the exhaust cam, which is for me a lot more straightforward and something I'm much more comfortable with. The other thing you ought to do when you're here is verify the valve timing. And this engine's a little unusual in my mind about doing valve timing, because you do it by taking rods that fit into holes in the back of the sprocket, and when you're perfectly timed at top dead center, the rods line up exactly with the top of the this surface for the cam cover. And so you verify that your timing is right. So when you put it all back together, you go back to the same place. Now, what I used here, I'm sure there's factory tools to do this. I use 5/32 drill bits, and then I set them aside for the next time I do this. And I'll mention this photo ought to make you nervous because I don't have any FME or foreign material exclusion covers here. If you drop something down into this opening, you are screwed. And I don't normally let these sit open like this, except this was right when I had to move the timing chain. If you're moving the timing chain, you really can't have the covers in there. But anytime that you have that open, that has got to be covered because it's a disaster if you drop something down there. Okay, and let's see, I got one little surprise here too. As I was taking off the coolant pipe that goes across the front of the engine, I found that someone had put in before, so I had to order that little O-ring and clean all that up when I put it back together. I do not like to find red RTV on an engine. Okay, so and I'll go over to the right side of the engine, and this is what I was the most nervous about, and it was you have to get this electrical harness disconnected, and you pick it up and you fold it back against the windshield, and I used some masking tape to hold it against the windshield. This is a 1994 car, and they have the infamous biodegradable wiring harness, and I was really worried that my wiring harness was going to fall apart and I have to end up replacing it. Fortunately, I didn't have that problem. It appears that the wiring harness had already been replaced, but I can't tell you how nervous I was about that. But in fact, you don't even have to take it out of that track. The whole track comes out. You have to disconnect the two fuel lines here, and then all this comes off with the head. Now, the other thing that was a little irritating on this one is that I could not get these connections off. This is under the intake manifold and has to be removed to remove the head. And I got this clamp off and pulled this vacuum line off. It was really stiff. I ended up replacing it. I could not get this clamp off. And likewise, this is the back of the head. Way down here, there is a coolant line. I could undo the hose clamp, but I could not get to this line to remove it. And so what I actually did is I lifted the head about 2 inches after everything else was off, and I then was able to access these. And this gives you perspective after the head's off. This is where those 2 lines were, and you can see how much I destroyed that hose clamp when I was trying to remove it. But I lifted the head about 2 inches. I got these 2 off, and I got the coolant line off because I could finally get my hand on it. When I put this back together, I put regular Mercedes hose clamps on these because they're an awful lot easier to manipulate in a limited access environment. The other frustration I had with this one was that I was planning to remove the exhaust manifolds with the head. And so I pulled the bolts for the downpipes and everything else needed to be able to just go up with the head with the exhaust manifolds on it. And I could not get the exhaust manifolds loose from the downpipe. And so then I had to go through the manipulation to remove the manifold bolts from below. And this gives you an appreciation for why you normally do this, removing the exhaust manifolds with the head, because these bolts on the bottom are really, really hard to get to. When I finally got them all off, the front manifold came off the downpipe. The rear one never did until I was starting to put it all back together. So that became a real pain. And I really wanted to do it the way I'd planned. Another thing I want to comment on is that this is a place where you really want to use a Mercedes OEM head gasket. This is not a place to cheap out on head gaskets because there have been a lot of revisions on this head gasket, and you want to use the most recent Mercedes gasket on this one. There's too many man hours in this to cheap out on the head gasket. And the other thing I'll comment here is once you have it all apart, you spend an awful lot of time cleaning. I mean, you check the block and the head for any warpage using your precision straight edge. But cleaning this, notice how many openings there are in this. and doing the cleaning, you really have to make sure you don't get anything in these openings. So I basically plugged every opening and then very judiciously cleaned around them, and then made sure that I unplugged every opening before I put it back together. Remember too, this is an aluminum cylinder head. It would be very easy to scratch this head and cause it to not seal. So I use mostly greenies, Scotch-Brite plastic scouring pads, and then very judiciously, when that wouldn't work for me, I used single edge razor blades very carefully to not scratch the head. The block isn't as sensitive because it's iron, and you have a hard time screwing that up, but these are very sensitive. And I even ended up taping over the valves and the spark plugs holes when I was doing this. The other thing Danny pointed out to me as I was preparing for this, and I spent an awful lot of time on this, is the cylinder head bolt holes could be a recipe for disaster if you don't clean the cylinder head bolt holes absolutely thoroughly. You cannot allow liquid at the bottom of the cylinder head bolt holes, because you can actually hydrolock and crack the head as you bolt in the cylinder head bolts. And there's another good reason to have those bolt holes really clean that I'll mention in a minute. But I actually bought new head bolts and spent a lot of time making sure that I could go by hand in all the bolt holes with new bolts, and made sure that they were really scrupulously clean before I put it back together. For reassembly, let's see, I don't see any questions in chat. So for reassembly, you have to remember, I'm still sharing, okay? You have to remember the items you didn't get to, that you couldn't get to, as you're reassembling. If you had to lift the head 2 inches to put those things on, then you have to pause as you're putting the head on about 2 inches up and reattach those lines, though it certainly is easier with regular old Mercedes hose clamp. The other thing to help you out, I used a piece of corrugated cardboard vertically in back of the head, because there's not a lot of clearance between the firewall and the back of the head, and it would be pretty easy to damage the insulation there, or especially get the head seating surface dirty by scraping across the firewall insulation. So I found corrugated cardboard worked pretty well for that. The other problem I had with this is aligning the head. You know, what I'm used to is just putting a head on without an intake and exhaust manifold, and it's pretty easy to see how the head aligns. When you have a whole big intake manifold on one side, and the exhaust side on this head is kind of hard to use to align because it doesn't really mount flush, I had a really hard time getting it aligned properly. It's got a couple of dowels that you have to seat it onto, and usually you can just move around a little bit, feel that it's seated on the dowels, and it goes on. And this one just wasn't doing that. I finally ended up lining it up using a flashlight and peering down into the cylinder head bolt holes. And when I had all the cylinder head bolt holes perfectly aligned, then I knew I was in the right place, and I was able to gently tap it in place with a rubber mallet and a piece of wood to gently onto the dowels. I was really nervous doing that, but I didn't see any other way of doing it. But okay, upper timing cover is a challenge. And I mentioned there are two places. Okay, there are two places that this engine typically leaks: the rear on the right side, and you really have to replace the head to do that, and the front on the right side. And the leak that happens here is in between the lower gasket on the timing cover and the front of the head / cylinder head gasket. And the sealing regime for the timing cover is kind of unique. There's 3 different sealing regimes. There's this green rubber gasket it sits on. There's a vertical metal to metal seal that you essentially glue together with something like Loctite 574 or dry bond, which is what I used. And then there's this funny little place in here that uses this blackish gooey thing that Mercedes has a part number for, and BMW has a part number for, and I think it's Loctite 5970, which is what I used. But what happens on these cars is that this little sealing place right here with this gooey, kind of black silicone sealant, the head gasket shrinks away from it, and it opens up a little place where it can leak in here. And that's the right front leak that these cars often have. You don't have to replace the head gasket to fix that leak. You have to pull off the timing cover and reseal it. And there's evidence that that had been done before on this car. Now I see there's a question here from Sam. It says, can you please repeat the steps used to clean the head? What items did you use besides Scotch-Brite pad and a razor blade? I used things like brake clean to help me, but it was mostly the thing that we in the Navy used to call greenies, the green plastic Scotch-Brite pads, and a razor blade, and pretty much nothing else. But I tell you, you have to be really, really careful using something like a razor blade on the head. If you look at Kent Bergsma's series, he says, don't use a razor blade on the head. Well, I would never have gotten it clean if I hadn't, but I was really, really careful in doing it, and it took me a really long time. But that's better than doing it quickly and screwing it up. I hope that answers your question, Sam. Okay, so I was talking about timing cover and the timing chain tensioner. Since we're on timing cover and have to put it all back together, the timing chain tensioner on this car is unique in my experience, in that it's a ratcheting tensioner, and there's no way to make it unratchet except by removing it and disassembling it, which I had the opportunity to do a couple of times. It turns out that you're committed to removing and reassembling that tensioner as soon as you remove the top valve guide, the top cam guide. Let me say this correctly. The top timing chain guide inside the upper timing cover, because that slacks the chain a little bit, and the tensioner ratchets out a little bit. Now the tensioner is really a pain to put in, and it has a very strong spring tension that you have to counter when you put it in. So once you've pulled it out, reassembled it, push the center portion in, and then you have to put the outer portion on against spring pressure. And what I found, let me go back one. I first started trying to do this by standing in front of the car. I could not do it standing in front of the car. And I got very frustrated with it. Went to bed, thought about it, and realized, let's try it from the side of the car. And so this picture of the cat on the little ladder is where I was actually standing. I stood on the ladder here. Notice I have a pillow on the side of the car here. So I'm leaning over the side of the car and looking down. This is what I see. And if I wasn't taking the picture with my right hand would be on this as well, pushing the tensioner in and using the ratchet to gently start it. Fortunately, this is a steel tensioner against an iron block, so you don't have the issues of screwing up the threads if it was aluminum. But being on this side of it and allowing myself to use two hands on it allowed me to actually get it in. And you really don't want to put it in until after you've put that upper guide in that's on the back of the top of the timing cover. I put it in not thinking about that, and then when I went to put that last guide in, I couldn't get it in. If I had been able to get it in, I would have had the tension too tight, and I still would have had to remove the tensioner. So I had the wonderful challenge of having to do this twice. Fortunately, since I had figured out how to do it the first time, it was a lot easier the second time. The other thing I learned in here is that both of the exhaust manifolds have to be fitted at the same time. Now, if you were fortunate and they both came off together with the head, you never had to take them off. That, however, wasn't the situation I was in. And I ended up bolting the back one on. And as I mentioned, it's really hard to get to the lower screws. And then I found I couldn't get the front one on because the downpipes are attached to each other, and I couldn't get enough spring to go out and get it over the studs. So then I had to take the rear exhaust manifold off again, fit them together, and then bolt them all up again. So I can tell you how hard it is to get to these bottom nuts on the exhaust manifolds. It was a pain. Now, other thing that happened to me was the cam cover leaked upon reassembly, and the leak was from this area here. There's 2 half moons in the cam cover, and there's half moon gaskets that come in the gasket kits, and for some reason this leaked. So I went in and redid this, and I had not used an original Mercedes gasket set for these, and what I replaced them with was an original Mercedes gasket set. And I actually used a sealant that I kind of like called Halomar on these two to try to make sure they wouldn't leak again. And it ended up not leaking again. But so once I did that rework, and I really don't like rework, but you know, the thing about working on your own car is you always know who to blame when something doesn't work. So I got to redo that one again. So in summary, and that's pretty much my presentation. I have plenty of time to answer questions on it, but I tell you, this is doable at home, but you know, it's just a little different from most head gaskets. I've never done a head gasket where the plan is to remove the intake and the exhaust together with the head gasket. But if I could have removed the exhaust with it, it certainly would have made it easier. And I don't think you'd really get the intake off if you tried to remove the head gasket or tried to remove the head with the intake manifold off of it. It's the access to the bottom is just that bad. So I'm glad to answer questions, and I'll do my best, and then I'll ask Danny if, if I can't. Any questions?
Well, we don't have any questions in chat, so if anybody has questions, you can just unmute and you can ask Gary.
Yeah, just unmute and ask. Jim, I see that you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, this may save you some problems, and Danny is probably more aware of it. But when I raced for Nissan, we had the same thing with the ratchet chain tensioner, and they had a special tool, but you could make one out of wood that you on a coat hanger that you just push down in there before you loosen the upper sprocket, the cam sprocket, and it would just hold it where it was. You just wedged it in there, and like you said, it can't go too loose, so it would just keep it from ratcheting over too tight. And with them, you had to remove the whole front cover too, meaning taking the radiator out and everything. A little hard to do at the track.
Wow.
But well, I may still have that thing in my toolbox because you had to do it sometimes.
I don't think you can get enough slack on the timing chain to pull it off if you don't remove the tensioner to allow you to get it. You know, it's pretty tight getting the exhaust sprocket off and over the intake adjuster. And the other thing I didn't mention is when you do that, you really need to maintain some tension on the timing chain as well. You really don't want the timing chain to run slack, because you can end up with it kind of bunching up and then being very hard to unbunch, or you can have it dropping off the sprocket, and you don't want it to do that. Any other questions, comments, observations, rotten tomatoes? Danny's smiling over there. Anything to add, Danny? I remember I mentioned before I did this to you, you commented how easy this was. Easy for you, not easy for me.
I got to give you accolades on this, just because I would never or have never tried to perform this job on the ground like you did. You know, we have the ability to have these cars in the air, and so when one of the things that you talked about was having to leave that manifold on there, the exhaust manifold, because it was tough to get to those bolts. That's really one of the easier things, because we stand underneath the cars and do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't even really know if the work instructions say to leave the manifolds on or not, but yeah, we in the business never would leave the intake manifold on. We always just unbolted and pulled it back 1 inch and left it laying in the car the whole job. That way you didn't have to fight those two clamps underneath the bottom there. You remember how there's a special tool now that they make that they came out with, not probably maybe 5 years ago, to take those little clamps off. But a lot of times we struggled in the business to remove those without actually breaking those nipples off of the manifold. So, and I don't know if anybody was curious as to where those two go, but they don't go anywhere. They go up into that manifold and they turn around and come right back out to that other pipe. Why they're not the same diameter, there's a storage area for some oil in there, because that's a crankcase breather, for that oil to just sit in there and gradually get back into the intake manifold, but it doesn't go into the intake or into the head anywhere. So, but yeah, when I was watching the video or the screenshots of how you did that, and I'm over here cringing, thinking, man, that is the hardest way to do this. But you did a good job. And the cleanup and the razor blade idea, a lot of people talk about that. When you talk about a razor blade, it's impossible not to use a razor blade, but we would stand it on edge. Instead of pushing the razor blade like you would normally do, you drag the razor blade across, and you can do some, you're not going to do as much damage, but you're going to be able to still be able to remove the gasket that way. So dragging the razor blades of using as a cutting device always is. And they make plastic razor blades now too that work really, really well. So
I actually bought a box of 100 single edge razor blades, and I still have most of them.
Yeah, we go through quite a few of them. So, but yeah, these jobs were very common. You know, I don't even know how many we've done or I've done personally. But, you know, it was always a good paying job. It taught you a lot about internals of the engine. It wasn't really that critical, but it's fun to see that you did this and was able to make your way through it. So nice. Well, very, very good job.
Well, it took a month too. I'm doing it a couple hours a day and then waiting for parts and all that.
Nice.
That's the way I end up working.
So like doing one in about 4 hours would amaze you?
Yeah, it would. Probably tire me out too.
Fun. I like that you talked about the head bolts. And the one question that I wanted to ask you, speak a little bit more so people understand about those head bolts being stretch bolts, and that you would do an initial torque on them. Then you would come back and you would turn them 90 degrees. Then you'd come back and you turn them another 90 degrees. And on that last 90 degrees, what was your feelings on doing that? And then when you felt the bolt start to slip at that last 90 degrees, was it kind of scary thinking you pulled the threads out?
Not only was it kind of scary, it was really a lot of force. I mean, I was exhausted after going through the sequence of torquing them and then angle torquing them and angle torquing them. I was really tired.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that they're stretch bolts. You know, what I did is, since they're not that expensive, I just bought new bolts and put new bolts in. But you can, there is a length spec on the bolts, and if they do not exceed the length spec, you can reuse the bolts. And in fact, afterwards I measured my bolts, and all of them were within the reuse criteria, and I could have reused them. But why? They're just not that expensive, and so I just replaced them.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to remember over the years how many ever measured outside of that spec that we had to replace. And I would say it's less than 50 in the 30 years we've been doing this, because they really do stretch and they really work well.
Yeah, my sense of it is if you're probably on your second head gasket replacement, maybe you're changing them.
Yeah, most of them don't get 2 head gaskets. When you use the proper ones or the updated versions, you'll never have to do it again unless you're going to do a valve job or something like that.
Yeah, and you know, I didn't touch the valves on this one. If I'd been doing this at 200,000 miles, I might have done a valve job. At 129,000 miles, with the reputation for this engine, I didn't really feel like I needed to complicate it by pulling all those valves out. Any more questions or comments from those in attendance? We're glad to address anything that you want to talk about.
Sure.
Everybody wants to get back to the football game, right?